I'll start recording, and whenever you are ready, Rees, you can go ahead.
Okay, do you want to dim the lights and get rid of our video there, and we'll go from there?
We are good to go.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. Let's go ahead and get started. The name of our presentation is Invasive Plants, Identification, Eradication, and Alternatives. We'll take a number of invasives, we'll talk a little bit about it. We'll make some recommendations for some native alternatives, and then the second part of the program, Andrew's going to give us some ideas on how we can eradicate the invasives. Oop, hang on a minute. Okay, there we go. Again, anytime you do a program, you have to start the presentation with a quote on your subject. A guy named E.O. Wilson, he's a noted naturalist and the father of biodiversity, said, on a global basis, the two great destroyers of biodiversity are first, habitat destruction, and second, invasion by exotic species. We're going to talk about the latter tonight. Behind this quote is a picture of Menor Marsh. Hopefully some of you have been there. And it's choked with a monoculture of invasive Phragmites or reed grass. This is before the restoration by the Cleveland Museum of Natural History. And they've done an excellent job. It's cost them millions of dollars, but they're well on their way to restoring this natural habitat. Let's start by saying a few words about what are invasive species and what's a native plant. The term invasives describes a plant that grows rapidly, spreads aggressively, and displaces native plants. They don't belong in the area they're growing in, but have settled in and are having a negative impact on the environment by reducing diversity of good species. This has a cascading effect on native wildlife health, including bees, butterflies, and birds. 25% of all plants in the US are non-native, and only 1% of these become invasive. Sad to say, 50% of those invasives were introduced as ornamental garden plants, and we'll see a number of those tonight. In Ohio, we have about 100 serious invasives, and their presence is varied across the state. The cost to fight these invasives goes up yearly. The Nature Conservancy estimated the damage from these invasive species totals more than $1.4 trillion worldwide, or 5% of the global economy. When invasives create a monoculture to the exclusion of diverse native plants, pollinators and wildlife lose forage as a source for pollen and nectar, insect larvae, and fruits and berries. Think about the Menor Marsh and the millions of dollars spent eradicating Phragmites to restore that valuable resource. Pollinators need a year-long supply of pollen and nectar from a succession of trees, shrubs, and perennials. Invasives that bloom only for a short period in one season may provide nectar and pollen, but not of the quality required by many specialist insects that have evolved with nature. The Federal Plant Conservation Alliance defines a native plant species as one that occurs naturally in a particular region, ecosystem, and/or habitat without direct or indirect human intervention. Keep in mind, a plant native to one region of North America is not necessarily native to another region. That's why it's important to make use of good reference sources like the USDA plants database that Denise Ellsworth showed us 2 weeks ago to determine native status in your area. All of the natives that we will talk about tonight are native to the Northeast Ohio counties. Native plants are typically more resistant to disease, drought, and other environmental risks than other plants. By landscaping with native plants in your yard, you're contributing to a natural habitat for the animals that reside in the area. Native plants also tend to withstand the environment better than non-native plants. Natives provide the shelter, food sources, nectar, and pollen at the right time of the year to support all forms of wildlife. When well established, native plants can limit the chances of invasive species overtaking your yard. So what can you do? Landowners can start by targeting plant species listed as invasive and removing them. I'm going to identify some of the most problematic invasives in Northeast Ohio and provide suggestions of some native alternatives to these problem plants. By planting carefully selected native species, you will encourage more pollinators and bird species in your landscape. These natives will be better adapted to our region's climate and soil, and they're more likely to grow well with minimal impact. More and more nurseries are making natives available as demand increases. And we put a number of these together and have a long list of them on the website. Here's a quote from my favorite author, Dr. Douglas Tolomei, from his book, Bringing Nature Home. Restoring native plant habitat is vital to preserving biodiversity. By creating a native plant garden, each patch of habitat becomes part of a collective effort to nurture and sustain the living landscape for birds and other animals. This picture shows a garden that our master gardener volunteers created at the Conneaut Middle School. If you're out and about during the summer, please visit when school's out. Okay, so here's a chart of the plants we're going to talk about tonight. The invasives are those that I have personal experience with or were suggested by Suzanne Westlake from the Ashtabula County Soil and Water Conservation District. That organization can assist homeowners in developing plans to improve their property. The native alternatives came from a variety of sources, including Holden Arboretum, the Native Plant Society of Northeast Ohio, numerous pollinator organizations, and of course, personal preference. Okay, here we go. The first Ohio invasive is Oriental bittersweet. My wife Megan and I first saw this vine while walking on the Greenway Trail south of Austinburg here in Ashtabula. We noticed it because it was fall and the yellowish orange fruit were reaching maturity. The vine was twining around a small tree and sprawling across the ground, smothering anything in its path. After further research, we found that this was an import from Asia in the 1860s, 1870s, used as an ornamental. They can grow in both open fields where they outcompete native perennials and woodlands where their stems can grow to over 4 inches in diameter, where they girdle trees and shrubs, and their weight can cause trees to fall over. Their fruit grows in small clusters in the axils of round leaves, unlike our recommended native alternative, American bittersweet, which has elliptical leaves and fruits in large clusters at the ends of the branches. This Northern Ohio native American bittersweet is not seen much in the wild because the Oriental bittersweet is such a fierce competitor. It does, however, have some wonderful attributes that argue for inclusion in your landscape. The berries are more than twice the size of the Asian species, and leaves turn a clear yellow in the fall. It will do well in average, evenly moist soil in full sun to part shade. Only the female of this dioecious plant bears fruit. So if you decide to try this, plant several to increase your chances of fruit. Growers produce this from seed, so they cannot guarantee the sex of the plant. We planted several last year in a whiskey barrel by a dead tree and are anxious to see if it fruits this year. Hope springs eternal. Purple loosestrife. According to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, purple loosestrife now occurs in every state except Florida and is considered one of the 100 worst invasive species worldwide. It's found in many types of wetlands, including meadows, rivers, and stream banks, pond edges, and ditches. We have several plants growing around our pond and have to pull them on a yearly basis. And find that they're extremely attractive to bees and other insects. We've also seen it along the Ashtabula River and at the Redbrook Metro Parks Preserve along Lake Erie. With their ability to produce as many as 2 million seeds a season and ability to reproduce from broken pieces, it can easily outcompete natives and form large continuous stands that can maintain themselves for over 20 years. They can be a major source of nectar for honeybees, but they also reduce pollination of nearby native species. There's been some success with biological control with species of black-margined loosestrife beetles that feed on the leaves, stems, and buds. So as an alternative, blazing star is the most moisture tolerant of the Liatris genus and would make an excellent replacement for loosestrife. For a month in mid to late summer, it sends up purple wands of flowers to 5 feet, which bloom over time from the top to the bottom of the flower. Butterflies, hummingbirds, bees, and birds utilize this plant. Many of the plant sellers in our resource list on the website offer this species from seed, bare root, and plants. It's also a great plant to collect seeds from and experiment with starting them. John Wright will tell us how to start perennial seeds like this in another webinar on March 17th. Russian olive and autumn olive. They both occur in Northeast Ohio, even though Russian olive is more of a Western species. Both were introduced in the mid-1800s as an ornamental. It was planted extensively in natural areas to provide erosion control and wildlife food. It produces large amounts of fruit and invades roadsides, pastures, and abandoned agricultural land. It likes full sun, grows as a multi-stemmed shrub to 20 feet high and 30 feet wide. If you're trying to ID them, look for trumpet-shaped white to pale yellow flowers in spring, of 4 to 6. I learned how to ID this guy by looking at the stems and leaves, which have silver scales with spines and silver undersides with smooth margins. The olives can bloom and fruit in just 3 years after germination, so remove these early in their lives. Once you eliminate all the invasive olive from your property, what can you plant that is native and non-invasive? When we redid our house foundation plantings and got rid of all our bad actors, one small shrub we planted was Rhodosier dogwood. We planted it to eventually harvest the bright red twigs for Christmas decorations and wreaths. What we found was a beautiful ornamental suited for Ashtabula's perennially moist soils. White flat-top flowers that offer pollen and nectar for many native bee species, and berry-like white fruit hang down and offer food for birds such as bluebirds, cardinals, cedar waxwings, and woodpeckers. If you ever consider a rain garden on your property, consider this shrub as one of the main players. I never liked barberry as an ornamental shrub or ground cover, probably because of its nondescript flowers and annoying thorns. The thorns can distinguish the native Allegheny barberry, Berberis canadensis, with three-pronged spines from the Japanese species, with a single spine emerging from the points where leaves and branches join. The plant becomes invasive when berries are spread by birds and mammals, and a thicket develops from root creepers and branches rooting upon contact with the ground. Leaf litter from this plant can raise the pH of the soil, making it unsuitable for local natives. If this is not bad enough, stand of this plant harbor a higher abundance of deer ticks. Winterberry holly is a deciduous holly that loses its leaves in the fall, has attractive bright red fruit that is eaten by over 48 species of birds. It's a great choice for a moist shady area and can grow to a height of 15 feet. It will not get that tall because you will be cutting the berry-laden branches for your winter decorations if you get to them before the birds. There are close to 60 cultivars of the shrub to choose from, as well as the straight species. Plants are either male or female, and you'll need the correct match to get the best fruiting. You need to find a pair where the pollen of the male matures at the same time the female flower is receptive to pollination. A good nursery will be able to tell you what male to get to cover pollination of up to 10 female plants. In the fall of 2020, while staying socially distant here at home, I did mortal combat with both common and particularly glossy buckthorn. They'd become quite thick at the edge of our woods, along with multiflora rose, which is a story for later in the talk. Both are more examples of imports from Europe for use as ornamentals, although I do not see any redeeming value. Both can grow as multi-stemmed or single-trunked trees up to 20 feet. Foliage is the key to identifying these, with simple alternate oval leaves ending in a tip with smooth leaf margins and 8 to 10 pairs of veins curved up towards the tip. The terminal buds are in pairs resembling the hoof of a buck, giving rise to the common name buckthorn. Dark purple or black fruits ripen in fall and persist through winter until eaten. Stumps that are cut back often resprout and require repeated treatments with herbicides such as glyphosate. One last point, removal of buckthorn can decrease invasive earthworm density to the benefit of native plant communities. An alternative might be common pear, also called wild or American pear. It's a small native tree that is seeing an increase in popularity. They used to be one of the most established food crops of indigenous agriculture. It has been in decline because it was displaced by many different invasives like the buckthorns in the prairie or thicket environment at edge of woodlands and in old field margins. It is quite beautiful, with white flowers in umbels that open prior to or during leaf emergence. These flowers are self-incompatible and require a pollinator seeking both pollen and nectar to become fertilized. They provide this early nectar source before herbaceous perennials are in bloom and are especially welcomed by emerging queen bumblebees who need to feed newly hatched larvae in April and May. Plus, common plums are hosts for hundreds of native caterpillars that help transfer energy up the food chain. The small red fruit are more energy dense than commercial plums and are said to make a tasty fruit. We found a mail order source for these in Ohio and have a half dozen growing in pots that we will be planting next year to replace the buckthorn. Honeysuckles. We're going to lump together here 3 different honeysuckles that are all present in Northeast Ohio, and all are invasive. Amur honeysuckle was promoted as recently as the 60s by the USDA Soil Conservation Service for erosion control and wildlife cover. Amur is a large shrub and more aggressive than the others. It's the most shade tolerant, and because it can survive under tall trees, it has the greatest potential to spread into the forest interior. Morrow's honeysuckle is a shorter but more densely branched shrub with long stalks on which flowers and fruit form. Japanese honeysuckle, it's a woody vine with a trailing or climbing growth habit that can go to over 30 feet. All the honeysuckles have fragrant and nectar-rich white tubular flowers that usually grow in pairs, giving way to black fruit in August to September. Japanese honeysuckle can completely cover trees and shrubs and cause their collapse due to the weight. They prevent the germination and growth of understory trees and shrubs and inhibit forest regeneration. The shrub honeysuckles can cause the same problems in displaced native tree seedlings. There's also evidence that they're what's called allelopathic and produce chemicals that inhibit the germination and growth of other plants. I read an Ohio State study recently that found that bush honeysuckle causes cardinals that eat the berries to be less genetically fit. The less nutritious berries than those of displaced native plants, such as dogwood and cranberries, was the cause and is making the species much less healthy. Serviceberry. We bought 3 Shadblow serviceberry at a plant auction over 10 years ago, and they've thrived on our property and given us much pleasure. There are several species of serviceberry that are native to our area. Amelanchier canadensis is Shadblow serviceberry. Amelanchier laevis, known as Allegheny serviceberry, and Amelanchier arborea is commonly called downy serviceberry. They're all upright, rounded, medium-sized trees or shrubs that can grow to 20 feet. They can be sited in a woodland, understory, or near a building foundation or as a specimen plant. The white, flat, open flowers open in April to May and are available to a range of native bees who are required for good pollination and fruit set. The dark blue fruit are quite tasty, ripen in June to July, and can be picked and made into jelly if you can get them before the birds. Marauding bands of cedar waxwings know exactly when the berries are ripe and descend on the trees to feast. Continuing with the theme of edible shrubs to replace bush honeysuckles, here's one of medium size of 4 to 17 feet, or 7 to 14 feet. The flat top flowers of elderberry bloom for a short time in July, followed by the clustered fruit in a drupe-like berry that is black to blue at maturity. If you're a jelly or pie baker, or even a winemaker, this shrub is for you. You will, however, need to fight over 50 species of songbirds that relish the fruit. An interesting characteristic of this plant is the pith-filled stems that can provide nesting sites for small and medium-sized cavity nesting birds. These pithy stems can die back to the ground during the winter, and if cut back to a foot in spring, will regrow from the ground the following spring. The picture in the bottom right here is one that we got from our friend Becky Donaldson, naturalist at Menor Marsh, showing a bee burrow in an elderberry stem. trumpet honeysuckle. So rather than the Japanese honeysuckle, let's go with a native one. Trumpet honeysuckle is a more well-behaved native of our area with value as an ornamental vine and a good resource to wildlife. The climbing, twining vine has smooth, glossy, semi-evergreen leaves and clusters of crimson tubular flowers at the ends of the stems. The leaf shapes are highly variable with a thick, leathery texture, and the uppermost leaves are fused together just below the flower cluster. Small, deep red berries follow flowering and mature in the fall. The flowers are visited by hummingbirds and long-tongued pollinators like the sphinx moth. The plant is a host plant for the spring azure butterfly and bees that can fit in the trumpet flower. It grows to 10 to 15 feet and can easily be controlled by pruning, making it a good neighbor in the landscape. Winter creeper, you've probably all seen this. This is an overused perennial evergreen ground cover that is starting to become invasive after being introduced in the US in the early 1900s. It's chosen for the home landscape because it can grow in full sun to heavy shade, tolerate poor soil, and a wide pH range. Horticulturalists have hybridized over 60 cultivars, including different variegated choices. Even though the Ohio Invasive Plant Council considers this plant invasive, it is not currently banned for sale by the Ohio Department of Agriculture like other invasives and is regularly available in nurseries and garden centers. Euonymus can find its way into the woods and displace natives, especially where gaps are created due to dead or fallen trees. It can climb trees by use of aerial roots, and the waxy leaves make it difficult to control, even with herbicide applications. As we lose ash trees to the emerald ash borer, winter creeper can move into the open space created. To replace winter creeper, we're looking for a native ground cover that grows well in the shade and will grow into a colony that expands each year. Wild ginger fills the bill and also makes an excellent addition to your shade garden. And it has an interesting story. Wild ginger's flower is located at the base of the plant, lying adjacent to the ground. It is bell-shaped and brownish purple in color. The flower is adapted to attract small pollinating flies that emerge from the ground in early spring and enter the flower to escape the cold and eat the pollen. They move the pollen from flower to flower. When the seeds ripen, they have a little oily appendage called an eliosome. This attracts ants to carry the seeds off to their underground home where they consume the food and leave the seeds to germinate. An additional bonus is that wild ginger is an alternate host for the pipevine swallowtail butterfly, an Ohio native. Don't confuse our native wild ginger with European ginger, which has a more shiny and leathery leaf. Burning bush. Burning bush is also a member of the Euonymus family. It's another plant introduced from Europe for use in landscaping. Despite its invasive nature, it remains extremely popular for its hardiness, winged stems, and intense red foliage in the fall. It is everywhere when a hedge is needed in parks, commercial, and residential landscape. If left untrimmed, it can grow to 20 feet and be confused with our native sweet gum tree because of its winged stems. In the wild, hundreds of seedlings can be found under the parent plant where seeds drop in what is termed a seed shadow. When I was researching this talk, it was about at this point that I realized not only was I recommending natives with value to wildlife and pollinators, but plants with fruit that I like to eat. Black chokeberry fits perfectly. It is a mounting shrub growing to 4 to 6 feet and works in full sun to partial shade. It grows in wet to dry conditions, but does not like alkaline soils, making it suitable to Northeast Ohio. White flowers open in mid-spring, followed by glossy black fruit among burgundy red leaves in fall. You can use this plant for mass plantings, informal hedges, and pond plantings. Flowers are self-compatible and are not reliant upon insects for pollination, but both large and small bees relish the pollen and nectar offered. We planted several plants in a bed with red raspberries 3 years ago and just got fruit this past year. After tasting the juicy fruit, we decided we needed more and now have several more to be planted. This tree is my favorite invasive to talk bad about. On the surface, this pear tree seems to be the perfect tree and is promoted by landscapers as such. It has perfect pyramidal form, wall-to-wall white flowers in early spring, beautiful red to purple fall color, with the leaves holding on well into fall to disease and pests. It's also tolerant to drought, heat, and pollution, making it a choice of commercial landscapers and municipalities. If you live in the Ashtabula area, you've all seen them on Lake Road, leaving the harbor to the east and coming into Geneva on Route 531. Oh, and they were bred to be sterile, meaning they could not set seed. So what's the problem? First, the wood is weak, and after growing for 10 to 15 years, the wood splits and the tree could fall apart. Next, it was discovered that even though certain cultivars were sterile, they would cross-pollinate with other fertile cultivars and produce copious amounts of seed, which is spread by birds. Naturalized populations are now common along roads, fallow fields, woodland edges, and thickets. The Ohio Department of Agriculture has banned them for sale, but not until 2023 to allow growers to sell off their stock. We've talked about several natives that would make good replacements to Callery pear. Wild plum, chokeberry, and serviceberry would do simply fine, as would the common hazelnut. This shrub grows to 15 foot tall and is thickly branched. The striking leaves are doubly serrate and quite large, providing good nesting habitat for songbirds, and change to a bright yellow to gold in the fall. The plant has male and female flowers separate but on the same plant. Male flowers develop into long catkins. The female flowers develop with several flowers together in a protective bract that develops into a cluster of nuts that are eaten by woodpeckers, blue jays, and even wild turkey. The catkins are a source of food for chipmunks, squirrels, mice, and rabbits. They're also used as a host plant by over 130 species of moths and butterflies, a truly versatile shrub to have around for wildlife. Garlic mustard. Here's another invasive you've seen along the side of the road. Garlic mustard gets its name from the odor of the crushed leaves. The plant is a biennial, which means the seeds germinate and form a rosette of kidney-shaped leaves with scalloped edges the first year. Second year plants bolt in spring and set up a flowering stalk to 3 feet tall with white flowers and leaves that are triangular and toothed. After flowering, the plant dies, and up to 900 seeds per plant are dispersed by gravity and the movement of water, where they can remain viable for up to 7 years. Garlic mustard can colonize any undisturbed area where it competes for light and space with many spring blooming wildflowers such as trout lilies, spring beauty, wild ginger, bloodroot, and trillium. Garlic mustard inhibits the growth of toothwort, which is a host plant for the endangered West Virginia white butterfly. Unable to find the toothwort, the butterfly lays its eggs on garlic mustard, and the larvae feed on the leaves and fail to thrive. Garlic mustard can be removed by hand, which should be done before seeds are produced. John Wright, our upcoming seed starting speaker, may tell you that since it is edible, you can eradicate it by eating it in a salad. Since garlic mustard displaces spring wildflowers, why not replace it with one after it is eliminated? Bloodroot is one of the first ephemerals to flower in the spring with showy white petals that are over 2 inches in width. As an ephemeral, bloodroot has a short blooming season and must produce a flower before the trees leaf out and shade them out. They have a cluster of bright yellow stamens that attract pollinators, but they get no reward from visiting the flowers since they produce no nectar. Since there are so few flowers blooming in the early spring, they have no choice, and if the flowers are not visited by pollinators, they can self-pollinate. Since self-pollination does not produce any genetic diversity, it's a backup to ensure survival of the species. Bloodroot has the same sticky oil that covers the seeds as wild ginger, and ants collect and disperse the seeds. Bloodroot is a great complement in the woodland garden with other wildflowers such as wild ginger, spring beauties, and Dutchman's breeches. Okay, I saved the best or worst till last. It was probably the worst decision ever made by the U.S. Soil Conservation Service to import this shrub for use in erosion control and as a living fence. The canes can grow up to 10 feet tall with recurved thorns that can penetrate most clothing. The base of each leaf stalk bears a pair of fringed bracts that are the best characteristic to use in distinguishing multiflora from native roses. Clusters of showy white flowers bloom in late May or June. The flowers produce copious quantities of sweet pollen. Let's do some math. Each cane on a large plant has 40 to 50 flower stalks. Each stalk can contain an average of 50 rose hips or fruit. Each hip contains an average of 7 seeds. Thus, each cane could potentially produce up to 17,500 seeds, and they are 90% viable and can remain in the soil for 20 years. Control is possible, but takes a combination of manual, mechanical, and chemical means with frequent follow-up, or get some goats who seem to love them. Arrowwood viburnum has several characteristics like multiflora rose without the annoying thorns and invasive behavior. They prefer open woods margins, stream beds, and an acid soil in sun to park shade. Flowering occurs in May to June, and fruiting begins in August to November. The dense foliage, white flower clusters, and dark blue berries make it an attractive landscape plant. Many different cultivars have been developed by growers and persistence of fruit. Many bird and bee species seem to prefer the flowers and fruit. When we planted ours, we were warned about viburnum leaf beetle as a pest that skeletonized the leaves, but we have not found this to be a problem. There are many wonderful native viburnum species to try in your landscape, but avoid some like the cranberry viburnum, linden viburnum, and Japanese snowball, all of European origin that are shown to be invasive. Okay, I hope we've given you some valuable information on identifying invasives that may be present in your landscape and some beautiful local native alternatives that you may want to add to take their place. I'll turn this back to Andrew now, who will tell you about some eradication techniques.
Thank you so much, Reese. That was fantastic. I'm sure many of you are familiar with at least some of those invasive species, and one great thing that Reese provided was not only what they looked like, but what to replace them with, and I think that is so important because oftentimes we just get told you got to remove it, and then we don't know what to put in its place. So adding those native plants that are native pollinators and are native to the area is a great tip. So thank you, Reese, for sharing that. I'm going to be sharing my screen here on how to eradicate some of those invasive plants, how to get rid of them. And we will wait until the end of my presentation to answer questions. Both me, Reese, and Suzanne Westlake from the Soil and Water Conservation District of Ashtabula will be available to answer questions. And we got a lot of great questions so far, and we have some great commentary and chat in the Q&A bots and the question or in the chat bots down at the bottom. So if you do want to participate that down at the bottom, I want to remind you that you can use the chat bots or the Q&A bots to type your answers and just hit enter, and then it sends it and lets us view it. So I'm going to pull up my presentation here. All righty, hopefully everyone can see that. Okay. So I'm going to be talking about control methods. Now, before we get started, I am from the Ohio State Extension Office in Ashtabula County. And no matter where you are, I'm not sure about Canada. I know we have some Canada viewers, but if you are in the United States, you have an extension office in your county. If you're in Ohio, there's one in every county. Most states in the Midwest have one in every county. The extension office is your best resource for this kind of information for how to remove properly and how to identify some of these invasives. That being said, there's also other excellent resources. We recommend the extension. Obviously, I'm from extension, but the Soil and Water is a great resource too, and so is your local Master Gardener program. If you have one, they'd be happy to help identify. So, when in doubt, if you don't know if this is a native or this is an invasive, give a call to your local extension office, and they will help you identify that and provide you with information, hopefully to help control it. That being said, we're going to go over some different control methods. There's two main types of control when it comes to plants that you do not want to be in the area. I don't remember who said it, but someone once said a weed is just a plant growing somewhere that you don't want it to grow. So anything can be a weed. Rees did a good job describing what an invasive is, and I think invasives has a little more of a connotation than just a weed. So we want to get rid of the invasives that are on our properties. If we look at my slide here, the two main types of control methods are mechanical and chemical control. So mechanical includes mowing, pulling, grinding, anything that you can do by hand or machine. And chemical control is the use of pesticides, specifically herbicides, to control your plant. And that can be done in a multitude of ways. Some examples include foliar spraying, so spraying on the green part or the leaf part of some of these invasives, excuse me, and basal spraying with herbicide. So this is around the base on the trunk or the bark or stem of the invasive plant. The cut stump or cut stem herbicide treatment is when you are cutting the plant off and applying the herbicide directly to that fresh cut. And then the hack and squirt method, which sounds the silliest in my opinion, but is a good treatment where you have a bigger plant and you don't want to cut it down or you can't cut it down, and you can take an axe or a hatchet around the outside of it, creating gashes, around it, effectively girdling it, and then inserting your herbicide into those cuts. Now, I know a lot of people shy away from using herbicides, and everybody is entitled to use whatever method they wish to use. I will tell you this: I understand people that are hesitant to use pesticides, but in my personal opinion, when I look at when I weigh the two options, taking an invasive that is not creating habitat for the environment, that is choking out other native plants, the quicker you can get that out is better. I'm sorry, I'm also monitoring the chat. Suzanne, I think you want to make sure you're sending it to
yeah, I see that. I'm fixing it right now.
Sorry. Thank you. Sorry. All right. Well, that's what I was saying. The quicker that we can get rid of some of these invasives and get natives growing there, the better. And you gotta weigh those two options, whether how fast you want to get rid of it, which chemical control is generally always the fastest method, and mechanical control is a little slower. You got to weigh the benefit of getting that plant out of there and getting the native in there, and whether you want to use chemical control or not. But we won't go too much into detail on that. I just want people to know that I'll be giving you all the options on getting rid of invasives, and depending on how much you have and how much time you have on your hands, that makes a difference when choosing your method. If you do decide to use a herbicide control, we really recommend, we can't recommend enough reading the label of your pesticide. The label is your one-stop shop for all information, one-stop shop for how to use it correctly, what to use it on, how to dispose of the herbicide when you're done with it, the container, the hazards, the benefits, the recommended dosage, that sort of thing. I have here some information from the National Pesticide Information Center, basically saying it's how you use it correctly and legally. So if you don't use it in accordance with the label, you're using a herbicide illegally. They contain information on hazards, instructions to follow in case there's a poisoning or a spill. And that last sentence that I have up there, following the label instructions will allow you to minimize risk and maximize your benefits. That could not be said any better. The benefits that you receive from reading the label and following it correctly are huge, and it minimizes the risk of something going wrong. So if you take one thing away from this in controlling invasives, it is making sure you read the label. It's so important. And it often answers your questions on, how much should I apply? How should I apply? So I'll be giving some herbicide recommendations for chemicals. So if you do decide to use one of those chemicals, say you decide to use glyphosate, there's different types of glyphosate available in different bottles, and Roundup is the main brand that we think of when we think glyphosate. There's different formulations, different concentrations, so you got to pay attention to all that when you're purchasing it, and reading the label will tell you if it's approved to use and what you're using it for. Just quickly, some of the tools that you may need. Gloves for your hands that, as Rees said, some of these have thorns on them that could be, punch your skin, and when you're working outside, it's always good to have gloves. Invasive cutting tools, and this is just a general term, but chainsaws, anywhere from chainsaws to hand saws to pruners or loppers. You know, depending on the size of your infestation and how many there is all kinds of cutting tools. You could even go up to brush hods that you pull behind your tractor, depending on what the scenario is. And then pulling tools. There's quite a few pulling tools on the market. There's some crowbars. There's some invasive weed specialized crowbar tools that help pull it out all the way up from the root, depending on the plant. There's a ton of different tools. It all depends on what you feel comfortable using and what you need for your specific job. So a lot of the time, you know, some of these you can make do with what you have around the house, especially if you have a smaller property or don't have a lot to do. But if you do have a lot, it may be time to invest in, you know, a small chainsaw or a brush hog if you have a large piece of property. Sprayers for herbicides. So if you do the herbicide route, you know, depending on the size, it's good to have a spray bottle or a backpack sprayer, or, you know, something that mounts to your ATV, or, you know, or a small utility vehicle that connects to the battery if you have a large area that you want to spray. Whatever's easiest for you. You know, if you're moving around the woods and you have a lot of ground to cover, backpack sprayer might be better, but it's going to be heavy. You know, you might want to use something that you can put on your ATV. And then this is also important, and something, again, to read the label. PPE, you know, personal protective equipment for herbicide applications. So, you know, making sure you have the right chemical resistant gloves, safety glasses, lawn sleeves, lawn pants, making sure that you're doing everything that it says on the label so that you are not exposing yourself to some of these pesticides and you're applying them safely. The last tool I have on there is persistence. And I put that on there because if you decide that you don't want to go the chemical route and you want to go the mechanical route, or even if you go the chemical route, it's hard to, you know, these plants are invasive for a reason. We call them invasives for a reason. If they were easy to get rid of, if you could just go out there and mow it once and it would be gone forever, or you could just pull it out and it'd be gone forever. These plants wouldn't be invasive. They're aggressive by nature, and they're hard to get rid of. They really are. All right. So I divided the plants up that Rees talked about into herbaceous versus woody plants. You deal with them a little bit differently. I have a couple different groups that I've clumped them in together on how to work on. And I know that we're approaching an hour here, so I'll try to condense this a little bit so that we have time for questions. But herbaceous plants don't have a woody stem above ground. They usually die back in the winter. Woody plants have produce wood as a structure and have a harder stem and can grow back every year. So herbaceous plants first. Rees talked about garlic mustard. I won't go too far into iodine. It is a biennial, like Rees said. And he's exactly right. You know, you can really smell it, and it smells like garlic. When I was in college and we were learning weed ID and plant ID, one thing our professor said is, you know, a lot of plants have a certain smell. So don't always, you know, you can use smell to your advantage. There's certain plants that have a certain distinct smell. So when you're IDing and you're learning what these plants are, garlic mustard one is one that you will never mistake once you smell it. But I encourage you, when you're, you know, in the woods and you're identifying other plants, go ahead, you know, rub between your fingers, take a whiff, and it helps. It gives you another tool in identification, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. you don't have to rely on sight. You can also use smell as one of your senses to identify. So for garlic mustard, mechanical control is an option. If you do pull the plant, either by mowing it or pulling them up, actually, in the spring, you want to do that before it flowers. Once it flowers, then you have a seed issue. You can do it after it flowers. You can cut it or pull it after it flowers, but we expect, or we want to bag it, put it in a bag and dispose of it some way, either, burning it. Probably burning it's your best option. You don't want to put it in compost, because then you end up with compost full of garlic mustard seeds. And garlic mustard can sprout from root fragments, which is scary, because if you pull it up and you don't get the whole root out, then you might have another plant. So I said persistence is one of the important tools. If you go the mechanical route, pretty much with any of these invasive plants, you're going to have to come back, 2, maybe 3 times a year for a multitude of years to make sure that you get full control of the area. I also have weed torch on there. If you do have access to like a propane hod torch, you can use that. But you want to make sure that it's after a rain, or at least the ground is wet. You don't want to start any wildfires or forest fires. And then for herbicide, foliar application, we talked about the different applications for herbicide. For these herbaceous plants, a foliar application is just over top. We recommend glyphosate and triclopyr, and those are both chemical names. There's a couple different brand names that you can find those. Like I said, Roundup is one for glyphosate. And this last point I have here is pretty important. The seeds can stay viable for 5 years or more in the soil. So even if you have complete control and you think you're in the clear, you're going to have to come back year after year, because this seed can live in the ground for 5 years before it germinates. So making sure that you have control of that is really important for a couple of years. Purple loosestrife. To save time, we won't go into any of that identification. I think Rees did a good job at that. And on our website, we'll have links to the fact sheets. So if you do want to do more with identification, you can check those out on our pollinator website. But purple loosestrife, like Rees says, is in wetlands and is in wet areas. So that puts a more difficult aspect of the herbicide control. And if you are near water, you want to make sure that the herbicide that you're using is approved for aquatic application. So you don't want to use just any regular old herbicide that we use for maybe garlic mustard when you're near water, body of water, especially if it's a creek or a major lake or anything like that. Mechanical, you want to remove young plants, bag them up and dispose of them, or put them in a pile and burn them. And then larger plants, you may have to dig the plant out to get the root system. You can mow, and if you keep it up, it will take several years, but you can get rid of the plant eventually, and you will slowly wear it out to the point where it won't come back the next year. So several years of mechanical control to control purple loosestrife. That's why it's such a difficult invasive. So woody plants. This next group, I put together the buckthorns, the honeysuckles, the olives, and then I also have Callery pear and burning bush in there. So these are some of the bushes / trees that can get pretty big. if you remember all of them, and Russian olive, the Amir, Marrow, honeysuckle, and the common and glossy buckthorn. Rees did a good job in the burning bush and the calorie pear. Rees did a really good job identifying those for you. And like I said, we'll have more information on identification and control in our website. We'll have links to a bunch of that information. But mechanical control for these, just like all the invasives, mean repeated mowing. For the larger plants, or if there's a high number of them, that can be almost impossible. You know, you think about the calorie pear, it's a large, tree, or maybe not a large tree, a decent sized tree. Let's put it that way. You're not going to be mowing it with a brush hog, but taking a chainsaw to it, and some of this other stuff is one way to mow it. If you can get in there, if you have a big enough tractor and a brush hog, you can do it that way. And if it's, if you just have one or two plants on the edge of your property, and you can get in there with a hand saw or a small chainsaw, that's another way of mowing it. If you are not using chemical controls, you are going to have to come back year after year and continuing to mow that until the root system is weak and is not able to push out another plant. So, in the spring and fall, you're probably going to have to go out there and make sure that that area is clean and mowed. If you do want to kill it, immediately within the year, then we recommend using a herbicide treatment. You can do all kinds of things with these larger shrubs and trees, including spraying the foliage with glyphosate or triclopyr. I have up there crossbow, which is a combination of 2,4-D and triclopyr. You can also do the basal spraying with herbicides, so on the bark around the outside. And probably the most effective, especially for the really large ones, and this is probably the one I recommend the most, is this cut stump herbicide treatment. And depending on what herbicide you use, you want to make sure you apply it at the right time. If you are using a water-based treatment, so a lot of like the glyphosates are water-based treatments, you must make the application to the stump immediately. Remember, a cut stump is just basically when you chop it off with, whatever you have available. You chop it off 2 inches from the ground, and you apply that herbicide directly following it. So Tordon, crossbow, glyphosate are all herbicides that you can use for that. Make sure that it has the name of the plant you're wanting to remove on the label. So when you're making your selection for a pesticide, you want to read the label and make sure that plant is on there and it's approved for that treatment. If you have, I say water-based, you want to make sure you get it on there immediately. If you do have an oil-based herbicide, you don't have to apply it immediately necessarily. You can put it onto the bark, within a week or two of mowing it. So if you have a really large area and, you spend a week going through and with a chainsaw and cutting it all down, and then you spend the next week going through and applying the herbicide, that's okay. But if you are using a water-based herbicide, you're going to want to make sure you make those applications immediately and not wait. Especially those bigger plants, like I said, I really recommend the cut stump method, because those big ones, you're going to have to spray a large area, spray up high, and not only can that be dangerous, it may not be as effective. And with the cut stump herbicide treatment, you're getting it directly into the roots, and it's not having to go through the rest of the plant, hopefully meaning better control. And yeah, so mechanical control isn't impossible, but just like everything else, you're gonna have to come back year after year and make sure that you're keeping those suckers and shoots from growing anymore. Barberry and multiflora rose these are two more that are very very annoying if you find yourself caught up in them when walking through the woods or walking along a fence row. I've found myself caught by this invasive many a time, and there's nothing more fulfilling than controlling it and getting rid of it. And that's partially because of how much work goes into controlling these plants. I mentioned having gloves and the proper equipment to control it. These are ones you're going to want to be really careful of what you're wearing, to protect yourself, especially if you're getting in there and cutting it by hand or with a chainsaw. You want to make sure that you're protecting yourself from the spines. All right, so mechanical control, if it's smaller, you can remove the plant and the root, pulling it out. I talked about some of those jacks that you can pull out plants with if they're small. And I recommend everybody, getting out there and scouting and controlling these plants when they're small is probably your best bet. Letting them grow really big, you run into all kinds of issues. Large plants are high numbers. It's almost impossible to completely control with mechanical control. It's really, really difficult. We recommend mechanical control, going in, mowing it down, chopping it down with the chainsaw, and then going in with a herbicide and finishing the job. But foliar spraying, again, glyphosate and triclopyr, like Darlon 3A, you can go over top on the leaves. Same with the basal spraying along the stem and the bark at the bottom. That might be hard, especially if it's a big plant. It's hard to find that base. It's often hidden deep inside many of those canes with sharp barbs on it. And then the cut stem herbicide method is one that again I highly encourage you go with. I think it has the best results, and it will probably be the easiest in the long run. Glyphosate, crossbow, triclopyr are all recommended for controlling this invasive as well. The vines, Oriental bittersweet, I ran into some of this during deer season this year. I need to go back this spring and take care of it. But, you think at first maybe that's a grapevine, but it's the berries hanging from it really give it away. And this, grapevines, wild grape can also cause damage to your trees, and especially if you're trying to grow timber. It's something that you want to control, so you can use this information to control that as well. Winter creeper is the other vine that Rees talked about. And the first thing you want to do, whether you're choosing the mechanical or the chemical control, is cut the vines to relieve the trees, especially if there's a lot up in the canopies of the trees or wrapping around the trees. The first thing that you should do is cut those vines so that those trees can continue to grow and won't get pulled over by the vine. And if you continue to cut after several years, as it keeps coming up, you'll eventually kill it. It'll exhaust itself and die, but it does take a while. Again, I recommend the cut stump herbicide treatment, where you cut it and then apply directly to that either glyphosate, crossbow, or triclopyr. A lot of these are very similar when it comes to these invasives, especially the woody perennials are often similar. Like I mentioned, if you can find it young and small, it's a lot easier to control mechanically. When it gets larger, it gets even harder to do that, and herbicide treatment is going to look better and better for that sort of thing. Like I said, it's so important that you follow the label and read the label. All the information you need to know is listed on there for a reason. So if you do use a herbicide, make sure to read the label. Make sure to contact your local extension or local resource, whatever you use, to get more information on specific plants if you do have a lot of them to take out, or you need help identifying them. You know, we'd be happy to help here in Ashtabula County, and I know other counties around the state would be too at extension. So I know there's a ton of questions in the chat bots and in the Q&A bots. So if you do have any questions, go ahead and put them in there. I have my contact information up right now, my email and my phone number at the extension office. Also want to give credit to Ohio State and Penn State Extension for the photos that I used in my presentation, as well as a lot of the information, and a lot of those fact sheets we will have available for you on the website, like I mentioned earlier. So I'm going to close out of this, and I'm going to welcome back Rees, and I'm going to welcome Suzanne. And there's Suzanne.
Hello.
Howdy. So there's a ton of stuff here. I was trying not to pay too much attention to it while I was presenting, but we have a ton of great questions. One that I saw, one of the first ones that came in that Suzanne, I think you'll be able to help with, was Judy asked, what are your thoughts on cultivars versus straight species?
So cultivars are basically just plants that have been bred for a specific trait. Maybe you like a certain flower shape, but you don't want it white, you want it pink. And there are plenty of nurseries out there that have cultivated them, bred them to be pink and purple and other things, but they are still at their heart a native plant. So they are still not going to be an invasive.
Excellent. And
cultivars have they don't add any genetic diversity to the environment, because most of them are created by clonal means. So if you grow something from seed, you got genetic diversity. We talked about author Douglas Tolomei. He argues for all straight species. He doesn't believe that cultivars are what you want to shoot for. I'm a little looser in that we showed some things that had a lot of cultivars, such as the winterberries, for example. Great native plant, non-invasive, but a lot of different cultivars. So don't go off the deep end and become a species purist. Allow yourself some room for good quality cultivars.
That's and that's an excellent question, Judy, and thank you for asking it. And that's kind of what I've read and seen is, if you're planting a native plant, maybe in your flower bed or around your yard, there's nothing wrong with the cultivar. If you're planting something in the back 40 or in a larger area and you think that it's gonna spread out eventually and replicate, maybe like Rees said, more biodiversity and using a straight plant. So
I think Judy knew the answer to that question. She was just testing us because She's part of the Native Plant Society of Northeastern Ohio, and they know their stuff.
There we go. Well, that's good. That's good for us to be tested. So someone mentioned, I think Judy actually also mentioned the Problem Plants of Ohio book by Kent State. And then we actually had Megan Griffiths Ward in the Q&A box too, who is an author on the book, say that, you know, it covers 148 species, not just weeds and nuisance weeds. And it seems like a pretty interesting, there it is. Rees has it holding up right there. I don't know, Megan, if you want to, I can unmute you if you want to add anything of your own. And if you say in the chat you do, I'll unmute you, but we can, if not, we can move on to the next question. But yeah, good plug for a good resource. All right.
I got one more here. It's called Invasive Plants, and it's by Kaufman and Kaufman. It's not as Ohio specific as the other one, but has real good reference.
Excellent. All right. Let's see. I'm looking at the next questions. Someone asked a question. Jack asked, he'd like to plant more natives, but the species, but he needs species that won't be destroyed by deer. That's always, even non-native plants. That's a big question by a lot of people, you know, especially if you're living in an area with a high deer population, and pretty much most of us, at least in Ohio, are. Suzanne, I think you probably have some information on that. I'm sure Rees does too. It's that could probably be its own presentation. Maybe
It could be.
We'll see if we can find a list of natives and put that on the website. I don't know if Rees, if you have any off the top of your head that you want to share.
Well, from the presentation tonight, wild ginger was an excellent ground cover that deer don't like. Winterberry, we talked about that. That's not a favorite of deer. And also the last one we talked about, which was the arrowwood viburnum dentatum. Deer don't seem to show a real preference for that either.
You mentioned blazing star too, right? They really don't like blazing star.
Okay. You could throw in red twig dogwood too, probably.
Mm-hmm.
All righty. Claire said, you know, some of us are beekeepers, so there's concerns about using herbicides without impacting our bees or other native pollinators. And yeah, I mean, we do understand that is definitely a concern, and that is why I recommend, you know, making sure you're applying it correctly. If you're out there, you know, spraying it everywhere and hitting non-target sites, there's definitely a chance to kill non-target plants and insects and animals and stuff like that. So following it best to your ability. Like I said, in my research, the removal of invasive plants in the long run will improve, you know, habitat and wildlife and insects that pollinate on the native plants better than you know, trying to remove it manually necessarily. That being said, like I mentioned before, catching it early, pulling it out early, mowing it before it gets too big is really the key to success here, especially if you don't want to use a herbicide. Anything to add on that, Suzanne?
Just that I would recommend applying directly to the stump rather than use foliar sprays. You might have to cut it and apply more than once, but eventually that plant will get exhausted and decide to give up the ghost, and then you can move on. And that way, you know, you're just keeping it to a small area.
Yeah, that the stump cut method, if you can't mow it continuously, that is really probably the best option for you, especially if you're worried about off target species. Someone also asked, are the parts of the elderberry plant poisonous? And
Yes, they are.
That is true. I think even the berry is before you cook it, right?
Yep. Raw berries, the leaves, the stems, they're basically cyanide.
Yeah. So don't eat those without cooking it. Be careful. All right. Yeah. Someone said, what's the best way to use foliar herbicides without impacting pollinators? I think we kind of covered that. It's difficult when you're doing a foliar herbicide to not impact any pollinators. If you're doing it correctly and you're controlling it, I think you can limit, but it's never 100%. Like Suzanne said, that cut stump method is probably your best bet if you're worried about impacting the pollinators on that. Let's see.
Somebody wanted to know the source for common plums. I don't know if they're still on or not, but I think we got ours from a place called Cold Stream Farm. And we also found the sources from Chief River Nursery and Great Plains Nursery. These are all mail order sources, so your plants are going to be somewhat on the small side, but grow them on for a year or so before you plant them, and they should do well for you.
Lake County Soil and Water is selling American plum. Ashtabula Soil and Water is selling American plum. So I would check with your local soil and waters too and see. Most of them have tree sales. They're going to be bare root seedlings, but again, yeah, like Rees said, keep them close to the house and in pots and baby them for a year, and they'll be fine.
Excellent. Someone asked if it will be absorbed through the bark of barberry for basal application. Depending on what the formulation is, you can. I would recommend if you're doing a basal application, I would recommend doing some sort of cutting, whether it's the hack and squirt method or just putting a gouge in it. It allows it to get into the plant a little easier. So if that's an option for you, that's what we would suggest. Are there any recommended pocket identifying resources for native and non-native and invasive plants? Rees, that's probably your neck of the woods.
Say that again, Andrew.
Pocket identifying resources. So books for identifying invasive plants. That one that was what was it? Problem Pests of Ohio. That one that was recommended earlier from Kent State seems like it's a good resource for invasive plants. Do you have any native identification books, Rees, that you can think of?
Are you talking about? Did you say natives?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, yeah. There's a couple books, and they're on the website under the resource guide, so they're included there. But these are books by a lady named Heather Holden. And this one's called Pollinators of Native Plants. And then she's got another one. This is called Bees and Identification, a Native Plant Forage Guide. And she goes into talking about native trees, shrubs, and vines, just like we did today. And goes into some detail on what type of bees favor which plants. So I've got one other one that I'll mention. Who did this one? Yeah, I don't know who did this one. The Native Alternatives to Invasive Plants. This is a Brooklyn Botanical Garden guide here as well. So just log on to Amazon and query. You'll get 30 choices.
Excellent. So Timothy asked, any good native plant nurseries in Northeast Ohio? And that's another resource that we have on our website that our group has put together. So if you check out the website, there's a link to where you can purchase native plants on there. Really nice comprehensive list.
Yeah, we put that together, and nurseries and greenhouses are still not carrying the amount of natives that they should. So when you go there, put a bug in the ear of the owner or whatever and tell them what you're looking for. And after a while, they'll get a hint, and they'll carry more natives and stop carrying the invasives, hopefully.
Someone asked, if I remove the multiflora rows from the edges of our woods, should I plant arrowwood, viburnum in those areas? Would it help keep the rows at bay?
I think the answer to that one, I'm anxious to see what Suzanne says. I think the answer is no, at least not for a year or so, because they're going to resprout and you're going to have to come back and fight it for a couple of years. If anything, keep it, 3-4 feet away, plant it, and eventually it'll help shade out the invasives.
Yeah, I would agree. Multiflora rose is just so aggressive that you have to be as aggressive to get rid of it. And I can tell you that you're going to be more bloody than the rose is.
We're talking scorched earth for years. All right.
Somebody asked about how to ID the multiflora rose, because
Yes.
I'd mentioned something. What I said was a fringed bract, so it sort of looks like a frilly petticoat right at the tip of the flower stalk, and no other native rose has that. And if you see it, you'll know that it's multiflora rose, and you won't get confused going forward. So it's called.
And the multiflora rose tends to be white when the native roses are pink.
Right.
And when they're in bloom, they actually smell quite nice.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe.
And 3 rose hips is enough vitamin C as in an orange. So you can eat the rose hips.
Well, we'll get rid of that by making tea, and we'll get rid of the garlic mustard by eating it.
Yeah. Someone said, Linda Dole actually asked, will using spraying herbicides in the woodland area also harm the trees? And that, again, following the label and making sure you're doing your application correctly, you should limit your off-target spraying. And usually if it's fully matured trees or, mature trees should not have an effect, as long as you're applying it at the right rate. If you're out there and you're dumping a whole bottle on one single stump and that leaches into the ground and the tree roots suck it up, then you might have an issue there. But if you're following the correct application rate and the correct application style, then you should be in good shape there.
And Becky in the chat had a similar question. She has a tree line with alternating big pine trees and burning bush. And if she cuts the burning bush out and applies to the burning bush stump, will the treatment be pulled into the soil to kill the pine trees? And it's the same answer. If you are directly applying to the burning bush stump, it should not poison the soil basically and kill your pine trees. And we're talking little spray bottles that you're going to spray directly onto the stump, or you can dab it with a rag or something like that and just coat the stump itself.
Yep.
So really targeted application.
All right, if I take out the, oh yeah, we already, that's a different one. If we take out burning bush that has been incorporated into the landscape of the house we just bought, should I replace it with some of the black choke cherry that would be in front of our house? Reese, what do you think?
That's what we did.
And
Yeah.
you like
Yeah.
the results of that?
I think that's a good choice. Any of these natives, as long as when you plant them as a foundation planting, make sure you get them far enough away from the house, the foundation, based on their mature size. Or you're going to end up with the shrubs that are banging right up against your siding. So give them some room to grow, find out how big they're going to get when they're mature, and go from there. We have a 150-foot tulip tree that's 3 feet away from our front porch.
Someone asked wood sorrel, how to remove that. I would follow something similar to the wild garlic recommendations. Like I said, you can contact your local extension office for specific details on that, but probably a foliar herbicide application would be the best, or consistent mowing. You know, if it's in your yard or an area by your yard, if it's really infested, you may want to just spray the whole area and reseed it. Having a good solid sod come up, a nice amount of grass will choke out some of the unwanted plants. And that's another important thing. If you're having issues in your yard with weeds or invasives, soil testing and making sure your pH and your nutrients are right is pretty important, because we can go into a whole conversation on this, but a lot of these invasives thrive where the pH or the nutrient level is not ideal for other plants. So fixing your soil might be a solution, at least around your house or in your yard or in your garden. Not so much, in the woods or on the back 40, I guess. One more question in the Q&A box: how do you control winter creeper on a creek bank? Again, we talked about controlling purple loosestrife in wetland areas. You need to be extra careful when you're controlling stuff near the water. You have to use special herbicides that are approved for water application, and you may have to manually remove some of that depending on what creek it is and how big it is. There might be more regulation, but it's that makes it more difficult when it's on the edge of the creek.
Yeah, because you also have to worry about erosion once you take a plant out.
Yeah.
Then you're losing that soil to eroding. So I'd almost have something else ready to go, maybe plant it below it, like willows or something that's really going to hold that bank, and then try and treat that creeper and then get something else in. Or you could also try something like coconut coir, covering it and putting it into that bank so that it would like smother it, but also protect the soil so that it doesn't erode, depending on how big the area is.
Yeah. Excellent. I think that was the last question in the Q&A. If you do have more questions, go ahead and put them in. We'll be wrapping up. I think a lot of people are leaving. Remember, when we're done tonight, you'll be you'll be automatically sent to the survey. If you could fill that out, we'd really appreciate it. You just have to answer a few questions about tonight, how you thought it went, any suggestions you have for next time, and a little information about yourself. Someone said, thank you, Suzanne.
You're welcome.
Someone asked how fast the chokeberry grew, Rees. Did you already answer that?
It's not that fast of a grower. We planted ours, it was probably a foot tall, and 3 to 4 years, probably it's about 5 foot now. So the thing is, it doesn't fruit right away, and we were ready to ask for our money back, but gave it another year, and we got fruit. So expect it to fruit probably on the 3rd year.
What do they say? First year sleep, second year creep, and 3rd year leap.
There you go.
Excellent. All righty.
Somebody asked, had a question in there, and I think I answered it, but asked me how I kept it away from the birds. And the only thing I can say is either plant enough for a share for the birds or net it. That's probably about the only 2 ways you're going to keep it from the birds. Same thing with serviceberry.
Stand out there with a tennis racket.
There you go.
I
You got to
see.
plant serviceberry for no other reason than to watch robins jump 3 feet to get the berries off the tree. It's a sight to behold.
Someone said in the chat something about composting of invasives, and I did touch on that a little bit, but anytime you are taking on invasives, I don't recommend composting it. If you have seeds, most of the time your composting yard's not going to get hot enough to kill those seeds. And then all you have is really fertile compost with invasive seeds in it. So the perfect growing condition. And then wherever you use that compost, you're basically seeding it with an invasive. So, getting rid of it by burying it, burning it, those are kind of your options. If you do pile it up, somewhere on the edge of your property, you just got to watch out for it to grow back and don't use that soil anywhere else on your property.
Either that or solarize it, cover it with black for a few weeks, make sure it bakes really well and kills those seeds.
That's a great suggestion too. All right. I think that's it. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Rees. Thank you, Suzanne. And thank you, everybody that helped plan the program. We will see you all in 2 weeks for the next iteration. And if you can, please fill out that survey. I made sure I asked you that about 10 times. And you will also get an email tomorrow with the website. We'll have the recording of tonight up there as soon as possible. I'll actually stop.